afternoon, panelists, and good afternoon, audience. We are discussing business and the law of Edtech. Now, in the past one and a half month, as a business media publication, we have been covering a lot that's happening in this space in terms of layoffs and running. We've come across headlines that is the Edtech bubble bursting. And before, we discuss some of the legal nuances around it, I want to understand the business side of it, and given the context that we have just said. And Amarji, I would like to start it from you. That given all that has happened in the last one and a half month, what does the current investment scenario here looks like, and the challenges that you're seeing for edtech companies?
Thank you, Arjun. In terms of the edtech industry, if you see the India market, so I was going through a couple of reports, and as late as October 2022 Forbes report, it says that India edtech industry is 10.4 billion 2025, with almost 37 million paid users. Currently, the market size, as per 2021 report, is some 700 to 800 billion US dollars, and they are saying that next 10 years it is going to be 30 billion US dollars. Now, that's the kind of growth and investment that we are seeing in the edtech industry in India. Now, is it going to remain the way it has been projected? Is it going to remain the way it has in last 1 or 2 years? We all know that pandemic was the catalyst, and it really triggered this online education and the tech platforms that we had. But at the same time, we are seeing in the last 2-3 months, we have seen a lot of layoffs happening. Right? I was going through the Facebook layoff, and there was a statement by the CEO, and a journalist asked him that why this kind of a layoff. And one of the quotes that he made, and I read that, he said that during the entire pandemic session, the kind of profit that they made because of the e-commerce growth, and they anticipated that this will continue for all times to come and this will remain permanent, and actually it did not. Right? So the same thing is happening in the edtech domain. It is, and my sense is that it is undergoing a phase of consolidation. There will be a lot of consolidation which will happen. Some 7,000 edtech startups in India. Right? There will be a lot of consolidation that will happen. A lot of investments may or may not come. I think it's in a stage where there is a lot of transitions. Coupled with this large investments that we are talking about, India presents a lot of challenges which they should be aware of. And the biggest challenge is the digital divide. And if you see the kind of smartphones, mobile phone, all this penetration in a rural sectors and the urban sectors, the gap is pretty wide. Just to give you a couple of data points which I have carried, only 8% of the population between the age group of 5 to 24 years have access to both computer and internet. And only 24% of the Indians have smartphones. And if you see the urban and rural divide, urban 23.4% have computers as against rural 4.4% who have computers. 42% have internet in urban areas and only 14.9% in the rural. So that's the kind of digital divide we are talking about. Yeah. Now, all of these are also linked with the infrastructure. Right? You can't have a successful edtech companies when the infrastructure is not there. Now, what is the scenario in India when we talk about the power infrastructure? Right? So I think there is a lot to do, and these are the challenges. But last couple of months and years, we have seen that there has been a tremendous growth in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. That is the area where this development has happened. And one of the things which all these edtech companies have to do is build up a local contact and local community. So these are a couple of my thoughts.
Right, thank you so much. We have a lot to talk about this on this topic, but we have a very limited time. Nipun, your quick opening comments in terms of the challenges that you're seeing on the business side of it.
Okay, so in a nutshell, first of all, is edtech here to stay? The answer is yes.
Yes.
What we do today will set the best practices for tomorrow. So as Amarji rightly said, the pandemic played the catalyst. It was already in a booming phase, and maybe it grew much faster than how we expected it to. So whenever there is an evolving area, the law needs to catch up. And if the law or the regulatory side doesn't catch up, there's bound to be certain gray areas which need to be addressed. But I'm going to speak more on the business side of it. I think 3 important areas where the edtech companies will need to take care. Of course, there's a code by the IEC, there's a self-regulatory body, and the code has been, in the discussion phases. But what really needs to be addressed are 3 points. 1, on the financial side, we need to not have any opaque agreements. There needs to be a greater transparency. There needs to be more clarity in what a consumer can expect, what a learner can expect. On the operational side, we are in the academic field. Let's not forget the education in the edtech. So, what are the means of quality control? How do we know the pedigree or the pedagogy of the people who are teaching? What's the sanctity of the curriculum? What's the sanctity of the degrees, the lucrative degrees, as we say, an online MBA or an online LLM also for that matter now? Are they true? Are they allowed to do this? This area needs to be addressed. And I think the third very important aspect is the advertising. We know that there is a boom, but we cannot let go of the ethics. There's been, of course, complaints of pesky calls, and this lack of transparency has even reached the ministry level. I mean, I think last year a notification was issued where best practices were laid down. Even the consumers, the parents were warned against not signing up for something that is like an auto debit or an auto EFT. So if we are to progress in the sector, if we have to move past the challenges, the greater onus is on the edtech companies. And these 3 areas, I mean, of course, there's a lot to talk about, but considering the respect for the time, I would sum it up with attention to these 3 areas. And as I said in the beginning, what we do today will form the best practices for tomorrow. If we need more players in the industry, we need less litigation. We know that a lot of these companies are being dragged into the court. There's a litigation. So this is setting a bad precedent, because then more and more newer players, competent players, will hesitate, because if there is the sector becomes more litigious in nature, many competent players will hesitate to foray into this. So if we need to address this bit, we definitely need to work on getting our house in order.
Right. Nipun, you rightly touched upon as to what are some of the areas that we should focus. But now if I get into the legal side, and I'll get Harish, who's joining us virtually in. When we are talking about the law and the law relating around the edtech companies, we come across the Consumer Protection Act 2019 and the E-Commerce Rules 2020. Harish, when it comes to recognition for edtech companies under these two, this act and these rules, what are some of the gray areas that you're still seeing here?
I think there was a debate on whether education tech platforms can still take garb of whether education is a service or not. I think we should consider that ship as being having sailed. Simply put, education tech platforms, whether they are a marketplace where they converge multiple teachers, or they are giving subscription models, or they are actually tying up with higher educations to give degrees, are all service providers in the eye of the Consumer Protection Act. The Supreme Court has really come out and said in various instances, while covering education institutions in one instance and not, for coaching institutes or institutes which don't directly impart the kind of education that education institutions impart, the law is very clear. So I think those arguments that they are not services may not fly anymore, which is a straitjacket fit into, do the consumer protection rules apply to you? Yes, they do. Were the consumer protection rules conceived with the thought of regulating education institutions or education tech platforms? No. Because if you look at the way product liability, deficiency, marketing, all of the terms that have been used, they are largely focused on classic e-tail models. However, having said that, as of today, in the way they are written, all education tech platforms will be covered under e-commerce entity definition, which means they will either be an inventory model or a marketplace model, which leads them to broad level compliances, which everyone can do, like appointing a grievance officer, ensuring that the information is correct. But where edtech platforms are sort of going to be more careful than the others is the you can't collect money and say I will not refund. There are two
Absolutely.
instances before the
Yeah.
district consumer redressal forum where they've actually already asked tech platforms to give money back. Now, uh, there was a phase where they were arguing against it. Now there's a specific law. Unless you don't need to refund money back, you have to collect. Marketing, you cannot uh, write fake consumer reviews. And it goes back to what my previous speaker was speaking about. You need to really invest in the pedagogy of your teachers, because if their reviews are bad, in some way or the other, you are going to come up and sort of get, I would say, not penalized for, but as a reputation that you might suffer. In fact, in the new e-commerce rules that saw the light of the day and then went back, the draft ones that came, there was the intermediary protection was going away if the sellers actually did something wrong. So an education platform where a teacher actually teaches wrong content, content which is not good for children, all of those are really serious issues that we do need to think of. And I think the last major point in the regulations that I would think uh, need a bit of sort of thinking through is, how are you modeling yourself? Are you modeling yourself as a education provider who is bundling up multiple teachers and imparting education, or are you just a marketplace which is collecting people? And that's where your regulatory liability sort of shifts, because the prior ones are still battling issues at a very local level on whether under the state education laws they will be called tutorial institutions which require registration. Those provisions have been written in the wake of private classes or private classes in a physical room, 20 students or more. This is the amount of space. This is the class teacher ratio. Nothing of that set applies to the consumer tech. So simply put, yes, they are a service provider from a consumer protection perspective. It might be very difficult to argue out of it. And sooner or later, you will see more specific regulations coming out for educational institutions. And marketing activities which were simply fail pass kare may have to be more properly written out, and advice should be sought on how one should protect against it.
Right. Thank you, Harish. Sahil, your quick comments on this and the nuances around these two pieces of legislation.
Just taking on from what Harish mentioned, look, there are a couple of aspects, and I couldn't agree more with what Nipun essentially said, right? On the edtech space, the numbers are very clear. Everyone sort of stated the numbers. There are 34 unicorns in the edtech space globally, 7 of them in India, 1 of them being represented on the panel. That's how all pervasive edtech has become. Edtech as an industry has perhaps, you talk about every business needs to have social responsibility, but there is none more that has this burden on them than the edtech space, because ultimately shaping lives, shaping futures, right? Essentially, insofar as edtech is concerned. So from an edtech perspective, there will be growth. They are here to stay, but they need to grow responsibly. All of those things are extremely pertinent. And I think Harish mentioned a very, very important fact. And taking on from what Nipun mentioned, responsibility, right? Customers being able to hold edtech companies responsible. Harish mentioned, I agree, zero ambiguity. It's covered under the Consumer Protection Act and the rules. There's one aspect which directly sort of impacts the edtech companies, and I feel it's gotten very limited attention, which is the misleading advertisement rules framed under the Consumer Protection Act. And what it does is, one, the compliances are incredible. Number two, more than that, it has specific provisions dealing with how you'll advertise to children or products that could impact children. So stuff like you'll see online, this product is only for 1,000 rupees or just 1,000 rupees. All of that in the context of children, prohibited. So it's the misleading advertisement rules which has gone far and over and above what ASCII had, which needs to be borne in mind by the various edtech providers. That's number one. The second aspect, and something that the Human Rights Watch has also sort of shed a lot of light on, is that the edtech players obviously have access to data. People said data's gold, data's oil, it's fairly important, specifically in the context of children. HRW is extremely worried that this kind of data is going to be misused. Children are going to be targeted. Children are naive, etc., etc. In that context, it becomes extremely pertinent, and what's going to impact the edtech players is the data protection bill. And I understand that there's a separate panel on it. I won't get into great amount of detail, but suffice to state that insofar as children are concerned, which is essentially those under the age of 18, who are going to be like a major sort of player or major consumers for the edtech players, there are increasing compliances, there are harsh compliances and compliances that need to be borne in mind by the edtech providers when catering to children. And it's going to be extremely important that way. Another aspect, and I'll just take perhaps 30 seconds, is the entire issue, and I do want to shed light on this, that you are ultimately dealing with children, right? So, but to a very large extent perhaps. The terms and conditions that are ultimately going to be entered into are going to be entered into with children. So is that enforceable? Is that not enforceable? So keeping that in mind, it's extremely important, and I understand UpGrad's done a great job there, where essentially in order to ensure enforceability of contracts, and it's an important one for people, the younger people who are sitting in the audience, it's been structured in a manner to ensure that the contract is with the parent or the legal guardian for the benefit of the children, in order to make it enforceable, so that if there are no payments that are coming from the children, there is relief under those contracts that exist. These are some of the important points that I felt sort of highlighting.
Sahil, you've actually set the context for my next question, which we were about to discuss, and that was data privacy. Now, two important points that you raised here, that it is that children who are, dealing, it's the children with which the contract is happening. They're signing up, and when it comes to data breaches in these couple of some recent instances, Rahul, I want to understand from you. Now, when we're talking about, he mentioned the data protection bill as well. How do you see the protection of data? What are the challenges that you're seeing in terms of the breaches that we have seen in some months, and the liability here? What are your views here?
Right. So when we say data protection, we need to first understand what is it exactly that I am protecting, and what is exactly the data that I have to protect. Now, if I go back in our conventional days, say 3-4 decades back, who would have actually thought of data being stolen, or there's a theft of data? At that time, I mean, the only thing was a person's personal property that could have been stolen, that requires some protection. But now we have evolved with technology, and with technology, there's a span of data that's been roving around the world. Now, this data, I'm sure that everyone sitting in this room has a mobile phone, which is actually like a limb, our limb, and that mobile phone is filled with data. Now, this data needs to be protected. Now, how do we do that? Various economies and various countries, they are, in this, race of bringing these statutes for protecting this particular data. And how do we protect that? Now, we take an example now, what European nations are doing, they have come up with GDPR. China has come up with telecommunication regulations. Japan has come with PPI. And US has number of laws, CCPA being one of them, around the same, for protecting the data. Now, when I say protection of data, what are the challenges? How do I protect it? If I being a company, I'm taking a person's personal data on record, how do I protect it? And the biggest challenge is, how do I take a consent that you are willfully giving me your data? So whether that consent has to be an explicit consent or an implied consent, or can it be even a tacit consent? So that's the biggest challenge. And then I have to be conscious of whether it's a critical data or it's a sensitive data. So all those points have to be seen. And then when we talk about, how conflicts will arise, as in we are not in compliance with this data protection, then we need to understand the particular geographies where these conflicts actually starts. So we have to go through the guidelines, we have to go through the statutes, we have to go through the laws of that particular jurisdiction, and then analyze where the actual breach is. And this is how we can, resolve this issue.
Amarjit, 30 seconds if you would like to add on this before I throw the last question to Harish.
Yeah, so definitely data is important, and one of my co-panelists talked about the importance of data when it comes to edtech companies, primarily also because there are kids involved, the children are involved, and many of them will not be measured. So, and then we just saw that a couple of these edtech companies had major cases of data breaches, right? So, the new draft bill does talk about, has a provision on the child data, and I'm sure as and when this legislation comes, these edtech companies will be regulated by that. But let's twist the discussion a bit, Arjun, and I take this liberty of twisting the discussion a bit. When we talk about edtech companies, what is that we are talking about? We are talking about a collaborative technological partner, right? A technology company who is collaborating with educational institution. That's what we are talking about. There is a difference. When you talk about an online education, it is the universities that we are talking about, right? When you are talking about edtech companies, they are only the technology platform which gets collaboration and help the universities in providing that technology. Online education was there, IGNU and B.R. Ambedkar universities, we all knew when, since decades they were there. So these are the technology. The moment we talk about technology, your IT rules, your data protection bill, everything, intermediary rules, all these will get applicable, right? And they will have to be aware of what these provisions are, right? So another discussion which was happening is, do we need a standalone legislation around edtech companies? The answer is no. I mean, in my opinion, there is no need, because they are nothing more than a tech companies.
Just because we want to touch the education laws as well, I want to know from you the UGC recognition of online courses, right, and what more needs to be done and what structurality it has added to these online courses.
I think the fairly large regulation, to be able to contextualize in a short discussion, maybe I'll take a stab at it for a minute or two. And I'll take UGC and AICTE both, because UGC came out with its sort of online regulation in 2020, and AICTE mimicked it in somewhere closer to 2021. They are largely, and I think Amar put it very well, so they're tech companies. They're largely talking about what is a learning management system, who can actually aid universities who are accredited with UGC or AICTE recognitions, and how those entities should sort of behave, how data should be stored, how money should be collected. The regulation sort of goes into that. It also, of course, covers how educational institutions should be giving on degrees, and there is a broad set of compliances on both players, less on the learning management system. But there is a recognition that tech companies who are dealing with higher educational institutions, who enable the courses online, which, let's say, for example, an UpGrad does, is not in itself an education institution. It is a intermediary, a tech platform known as a learning management system, which integrates itself into the university like a Maharashtra University or a Chandigarh University and gives you what degrees they are offering. Now, that is a set of regulations which covers only people who are in its ambit. Now, let's look at people who are outside of it. Foreign universities are not allowed to set up campuses in India, roughly speaking, right? So multiple foreign universities are using today tech management platforms to ensure that their degrees are also sort of accessible. These don't cover them. Similarly, AICTE, institutes which offer less than 12 months certifications like an ISB, etc., may not really fall under those regulations. So, and I think it will be a bit rich to call for over-regulation, because there is already lack of clarity on how these regulations will be implemented. What might be useful from the regulator's perspective is to just take a holistic look at the entire sector, take a step back and see who is performing what functions. Don't give the burden of education compliance on tech companies. Let them behave as tech providers, and as Amar rightly pointed out, let them cover and comply with all that is required to be complied by tech folks. Educational institutions who are taking core education activities comply with education sector regulations, because 29 states have very different education regulations, and you'll be surprised at the depth and length and inconsistency amongst all of them, considering state and center both can legislate on it. And lastly, I think there is another set of edtech companies also who are doing test prep upskilling, which does not involve an education institution. They, again, to the extent they are just tech platforms integrating folks, you can keep them out of education laws. But in the years to come, I feel education regulators will step up and govern some of those as well within the education sector. So I think, I don't know if I've answered your question. What more UGC and AICT needs to do is take a step back and wonder whether its regulation currently is doing what it intended to do. The moment pandemic came, they've just come up with 2 regulations without having much consequences to it.
Right. Thank you so much, Harish ji. My screen showing time up. This was an insightful topic where we could talk a lot more, but that's all the time we had. But still, thank you so much for your authentic commentary, everybody, on the topic. I think we touched almost all points. Audience, can we please have a big round of applause for all our panelists? Thank you so much. Let's have a photo.
Thank you.